women, it's a really hard thing actually to get women into research studies because we're cycling and people don't like to study how women respond differently in different parts of the cycle.
Even if it's not giving you panic attacks or like, oh my God, I feel so anxious, very subtle changes in brain chemistry, especially for a sensitive ADHD brain.
Look at the food diary and you look at the high histamine food list. What's the first 5 things I should look at, right?
Yep. Well, that's what's down the road, right?
Kind of what you're looking
at. Right
yeah.
now, it's like I'm still very curious to see.
Let's go.
Ready to finally understand your ADHD brain and feel like yourself again? Listen to Christine McCarroll's ADHD Naturally podcast for holistic women and discover how to thrive naturally.
Dr. Tyler Panzer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. Super excited to be here.
Awesome. So, Tyler, I have like all of these nitty-gritty questions I'm like dying to ask you, and I've been preparing for a while for this interview, but I wanted to first start out with, partly your journey, but I don't want you to tell me the whole story yet.
Okay.
Here's what I'm really interested in. I find that a lot of people, once they start doing, either they look at their genetics, someone looks at their genetics, once you start diving into the field, there's some like amazing aha moment where you just go, oh my God, that's just like the skies opened up, the light shone down, something is like understood now that was not understood before. And I know that you kind of started into this pathway by looking at some of the stuff for your own life. Was there a moment that was like, oh my God, here's the thing that is like, where were you all my life?
Yeah, so that was actually when I first started messing around with 23andMe. I got my raw data, and that's when I first found out about my COMT gene mutation. Have you ever heard of that one before?
Well, that's a big one with ADHD, which is
Yes.
my community here. So 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So I found out I have a double mutation there. Turns out both of my parents have double mutations there. So my younger brother and I, we were guaranteed double, like there was no way around that. No way around that. And for you guys listening may not be aware, that is a catechol O methyltransferase gene. And what that does is it methylates certain things, particularly dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, or adrenaline, noradrenaline, and estrogen to break them down. And that explains a lot about my personality type. And out of all the genes I look at, that is perhaps the, no personality or no ailment is due to just one mutation. But if I had to say, when it comes to like neurochemistry, personality types, that COMT gene, I think holds the highest weight. Like that alone can really shift personality a lot. And I break down dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline a lot slower than most people do, 4 times slower. So it makes me very type A, very go, go, go. I even think of my favorite song and I get goosebumps everywhere. But I also, on the flip side, I can get overwhelmed easily. I cannot watch scary movies because my fight or flight, when something jumps out, I'm like flinching, I'm jumping out there. It makes very sensitive nervous systems overall. And I'm sure we're going to jump into, ADHD is just one of many labels or under that umbrella term of, a highly sensitive person or neurodivergence. And, I identify as both here. And was one of the really big aha moments for me. Magnesium and SAMe, those are 2 nutrients that gene uses to function better. I tried those. It really changed my life virtually overnight. I discovered lithium orotate, which I love utilizing for ADHD. That's more of a recent discovery. So
I'm going to stop you there and I'm going to like completely rewind because I want to talk about supplements 100%. And actually this season that we're in right now of this whole ADHD podcast, but we're talking about supplements. This is going to be perfect. But I want to rewind because we're speaking the same language, but not everyone knows some of these things. So
I had that habit sometimes going too deep. So let's bring it back
so
ground
hard.
level. I want to make sure everyone can wrap their minds around this because it really is a whole new perspective of not just approaching ADHD, but just health in general.
100%. So we started talking about the COMT gene. I'm just going to I want to back it up to someone who's really never thought about genetics before. When you're using letters to describe this gene, like okay, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
When we're looking at genetics, are we looking at, and obviously this COMT is one that I think, again, I wanted to have this conversation, and this was like all over my notes, right? But like, okay, when we're talking about this, we're talking about one gene, but there's other genes that interact. What does it mean? You said you have a double mutation. What's a
Yeah.
mutation?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Double
Let's bring it back.
mutation. So let's like
zoom.
totally go back.
Let's run the tape
We're
back.
going back to
Yeah.
kindergarten here. So
Yeah,
start us
absolutely.
in kindergarten.
So our genetic code is the instructions that tells our cells how to make proteins. Think of each one of your cells as the city of Manhattan. And inside of each one of these cells, there's millions of people, millions of workers. These are proteins. So pretty much anything you could think of, whether it's to make dopamine, whether it's to break it down, whether it's to sense dopamine, whether it's to make vitamin D, whether it's to move cholesterol throughout your body, every single one of these tasks are done by workers. You need a worker to do a task. You need a protein to do a cellular process. So there's millions of these workers inside of our cells, and we make them from our DNA. Now, that DNA is misspelled. There's 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. Spells our DNA. That's all it is at the end of the day. If we're supposed to have an A, let me think. I'm pretty sure for the COMT one, it's supposed where there's supposed to be a C or a G, I have an A or a T. So, not to go too deep, but in that exact area, that one letter area, there's a misspelling there for me. What does that mean? That means that when my cells turn those instructions into these workhorses, into that COMT protein, it functions a little differently. That misspelling means that worker, instead of working an 8-hour day, only works a 2-hour day. So it works 4 times slower. So that means instead of breaking down my dopamine and adrenaline for 8 hours a day, I'm only breaking it down for 2 hours a day. So that's what can make me be very sensitive, highly excitable, and because I can't process that as well. So that's what these gene mutations mean. And we can, these have been well studied. They're linked to things like anxiety, like insomnia, panic attacks, even a startle response. So we look at the data. Well, that all of those pieces of data we see, it's the manifestation of excess adrenaline, right? Excess dopamine.
And how about that double and single mutation?
Yeah. So you have 2 sets of genes. You got one set from mom, one set from dad. We have 46 chromosomes. Half of them for mom, half of them are from dad. So if I have 2 sets of chromosomes, my sperm, my sperm only gets 1/2 of those because we need to cut it in half, right? Because you have half of the sperm meets half the egg. We got to get rid of half our DNA somehow. So it's a 50-50 chance which set of that gene gets passed down.
You're going to get, yep.
So I told you my parents each have 2 mutations. So both of their parents passed it on to them. So in this scenario, 100% of my parents' children will get both copies because no matter which set of chromosomes they give with that COMT gene, they're both mutated. But if someone has 1 mutation there, then it's a 50-50 chance. So this is why I work with a lot of families, and this is why sometimes kids can have very different health issues, different personality types, even though they're related. It depends on what's getting passed down. I've worked with families where mom and dad each have 6 mutations in a gene. One kid has 12, the other kid has 0, which is pretty wild when you think about that. My wife, she has no COMT mutations, which is good because she balances out my super sensitive, at times crazy mind upstairs here. But 100% of our children, no children yet, but down the road, 100% of our children will have 1 copy of that gene.
Yeah.
Because 0% of her eggs will have that mutation. 100% of my sperm will.
Yeah. We had to, so I have some double cousins, which for anyone who does not know what that means, it means
tell me. I never had heard of that one before. Yeah.
So my mom's sister was married to my dad's brother.
Oh, wait.
So essentially,
I have double cousins too then.
Oh,
I didn't.
hey.
how has my family never used that word? But
I
yeah, that
don't
happened to
know.
my family too. Huh. Go
That's
figure.
pretty cool. There are not many, I think statistically, I mean, there's not that many people who
Yeah,
have
like
that.
I people I call uncles that are older, but they're, I guess, older double cousins. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure that piece, but I will say
Yeah,
like,
I
yeah.
don't know. Yeah, yeah.
But so we always had talked about before we ever looked at our genetics, we always talked about, well, genetically we're like brothers and sisters. And kind of that's true, but each of our parents, so like my dad and his brother would have gotten slightly different genes from their parents because half of
Hmm.
that was split off, right? And same with my mom and her sister. So we all did a few years ago. We did our just like the ancestry DNA, and we were not even looking at the health stuff,
Yep,
right, at that
yep,
point yet.
yep.
I went into that
The ancestry,
totally for
it's the
later.
the gateway drug.
It was the gateway drug for sure. But we were just looking at like, oh, well, like where, where do our people come from? But we had like different percentages, right? So like it was all the same general map, but the percentages were wildly different. And we couldn't understand. We're like, well, if like we've always said, we're kind of like brothers and sisters. And it was actually like one of those FAQs on the ancestry side. It's like, well, why might a brother sister have that? And so but I'd never thought of that before. Like, yes, you do just discard half that genetic data from mom or
Hmm.
dad, and you don't
Hmm.
know which half it is. So
Yep.
yeah, we can end up with totally different things. But also to your point, we know that there's a lot of heritability to ADHD
Oh,
and
ADHD. I think it was what studies said around 80%
80%, right?
heritability there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very
And for
heritable.
me, it was like, oh, well, as soon as like I get a diagnosis, like it was because of my daughter, and then I'm like looking at my parents and and like all of the family members, like all came out of the woodwork as soon as
Well,
like
you,
I
you
started
can
talking about
unsee
it.
when once you pick up on those patterns, right? And that's coming from
Right.
me as well. I'd never been formally diagnosed, right? But looking, I'm sure you've seen like the eruption of neurodivergence content on social now and everything. And I'm like, oh my God, that's getting really, really, really close to home, right? So like looking back now, and then it's once you are aware of it, then you start looking at family members and stuff. You're like, oh yeah, that. It all checks out. But when you're living your life, you're just living
You're
your
not
life
paying
growing up. You're
attention,
not
right?
thinking
You don't
about it.
know. Yeah. Awesome. So you get your genetic data from mom and dad, half and half. You are talking about, okay, so you had these potential gene mutations with this COMT gene,
Hmm.
happens to be really big and important with dopamine regulation.
Yep.
So, someone who's maybe curious, this is like one of the first places they're looking. COMT is pretty much available on most like
Yeah.
commercially available
Yep.
reports, right?
Yep.
Someone's looking at their report and they're like, oh, I'm very curious now. I just did, what she was talking about. I just downloaded my raw data off of Ancestry. I'm kind of finding out like what's happening. So what are the markers that someone would be looking for? And what is that actually telling your brain to do with like dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine?
Yeah. So you're talking regarding the COMT specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I believe it's the name of it. I believe. I'm pretty sure it's 4680. I believe is yes. So the name of the mutation, they're called RSID numbers. So if you have raw data and you're not going to plug it into anything, you can
Which you should.
control F.
It'd be way
You
easier.
could, yeah. You could, if you want to look at this one, it's RS 460
Hmm.
4680. If you have an A there, an A means a mutation. So I'm double A there. And what this means, again, that misspelling, that worker does not break down that dopamine as well. And the thing with ADHD that, well, not just ADHD in general, how my brain looks at these things, there are so many different flavors of ADHD.
Hmm. Yep.
People think it's just the low dopamine thing. That's why they go and prescribe medications that raise up dopamine and norepinephrine and epinephrine as well. But there's so many different flavors, right? Like there is the low dopamine, low iron, high histamine, low vitamin D, high glutamate, high sulfur, poor methylation, right? These are all, if you look at the papers, they're all linked to ADHD, but that doesn't mean everyone has all of those lists of things. So
Yep.
like I think medicine is flawed in a lot of ways because we treat the label, we
Hmm.
treat the diagnosis, we don't treat the person.
Yep.
But yeah, so back to the COMT. Yeah, that's meaning pretty much all the time my body doesn't process these catecholamines, they're called, the dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline as well. And this can also play a role in estrogen as well. And
Yeah.
that's why trying to support find the right nutrients to give that gene the biggest fighting chance. We
Mhm.
want to, it doesn't mean that if you take more magnesium, you're just going to keep getting more and more chill. It's about restoring the deficiency. So people with a slow COMT gene, their gene already doesn't work as well. If they're deficient in magnesium or SAMe, it's like a quadruple whammy for
It's
them,
going to be
more
extra.
so than a regular person. But once you fix the deficiency, you don't just double your magnesium dose, you're twice as chill, right? There is a limit there.
Oh,
And
that'd be
that's
so
why it's
cool.
important, right? Just more is
Yeah.
better all the time. But and that's why it's so important. It's cool to look at one gene to learn for yourself, but to really give a really good protocol or plan for someone, especially with something like ADHD, you got to look at more than that, right? To build a comprehensive plan to make sure things aren't cross reacting. But yeah,
Hmm.
that was the first one. Like, that's still one of my favorite mutations. I could tell with pretty good accuracy just by talking to people within 30 seconds. I'm like, yeah, this is probably I call it adrenaline sensitive
You
people.
can smell it.
I don't like the word anxiety. You're not an anxious person. You're sensitive to adrenaline, right? And if we could
Hmm.
address that, you're not going to be an anxious person.
Yeah. And I think also just like realizing, like, and this is one of the things that helps me and like talking to a lot of women with ADHD. Like one of the things that's helpful is just like when you know, then there's not a like a moral judgment about what's happening.
Yeah.
You just go, oh, well, this is how my body is wired, right?
Yep.
So like if you know, hey, I'm kind of not going to be clearing this adrenaline very well. It's not like I'm a bad person because I can't like relax after a stressful event
Yeah,
happened.
it's not
I'm
in
not
our
like,
heads. That's
yeah,
what we're told
yeah.
a lot of the time. And that's what I try to tell people. The genetic testing could be very liberating and validating for people because it's not just me saying kumbaya, namaste, doing some breath work. Like biochemically, I'm hardwired to
Yeah.
not process. Don't get me wrong.
And it's
Breath
going to
work's
take a
they're all
minute.
great things, but
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why meditation and stuff can be so difficult for someone when the mind is racing so much more. And that's why we could get into this later. There are so many supplements that affect that gene that people have no idea about. That's making them more anxious. Their mind's racing more. And even if it's not giving you panic attacks or like, oh my God, I feel so anxious, very subtle changes in brain chemistry, especially for a sensitive ADHD brain, I could sense very slight. We'll talk about some patterns I pick up on, real life examples later on, but I could feel like last night was one of those times. I triggered my histamine with something I ate. I feel my brain moving a little quicker than I'd like. And when I try to sit down to do work, it's not that I'm horrifically anxious. Some days I am, right? That's just a sensitive person, right? But very minor changes from doing the wrong foods or supplements, wrong times for things. The brain's moving too quick. Screw this, do something else. That
Yeah.
could be a big factor for people with this brain. Sometimes it's not that the brain isn't, I think that I word this. It's hyperactive, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
we should be very mindful of anything that can add to that activity.
Add to the load. Yeah. And I
Yes.
think for women in particular, so it's obviously either sex we can present both ways,
Yep.
but typically we look at like a physical expression
Yeah. Yep.
with boys and we see more of that internal mind racing with
Mm-hmm.
women. And so that's why they call it like more inattentive, although both can be both.
Yep.
But absolutely that feeling of mind racing. And someone could look at you and like, oh, well, you're just like sitting there, but they don't realize that your
Oh
mind is
no.
going a
We
thousand
have
miles
we have
an
47
hour.
browser tabs open right now trying to
Yeah.
figure out. And the thing with women too, it's I think the sad reality too for a lot of these things is women throughout history have been trained to be subservient and kind of withhold, speaking their truth with things.
Hmm.
And that plays a role, not just like that imprints the DNA as well, what gets passed down as well. Like we've done there have been studies that show um grandchildren of, let's say, the example of Holocaust survivors. They weren't even in pregnant or anything, but multiple generations later, their DNA is still imprinted. We've seen some of that in African American populations due to the traumas of slavery. I'm not aware of any study that's assessed that with women through, systematic sexism. I mean, we're talking how many years have women been able to
Yeah.
vote and stuff, right?
Right.
So to me, it's all one and the same here, like some sort of trauma that these changes in imprinting are also linked to things like ADHD.
100%. And then also, if you have like genetic predisposition, then we add in the environmental
Yep.
factors, and then
Yep.
both the environmental factors that change the genetic expression and the gene are passed down across
Oh, you know your
generations.
stuff. I love
And
this.
then,
Yeah, this
yeah,
is great. Love it. Yep, you're
but
absolutely right.
but most people don't know that, and they're not
Yeah.
thinking about it. They're just like,
Yep.
well, why am I screwed up? And that's like literally the story we're telling ourselves. Like, why can't I just,
Why am I broken,
why,
right?
yeah,
And
what's wrong with me?
uh,
I do want to talk about more than just COMT, but I have to
yeah.
ask you because I don't feel like anyone is having this conversation. Yes, there is a big component with COMT and ADHD, but also with estrogen metabolism. And
Yeah.
so women who, and estrogen potentiates dopamine. So when we add
Yeah.
all of this into the soup,
And
like,
histamine.
yeah, and histamine.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
and estrogen and
All
histamine is a whole
all
other
these
thing.
excitatory things. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
I'm getting excitatory. I have to hold the histamine estrogen conversation.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the COMT and estrogen and how that relationship could play out as well?
Yeah. So, there's multiple metabolism pathways of estrogen as well. And there's very rarely, trying to think, I call them linear pathways where it's just a straight line, right?
Yep.
Normally it's like a web or a network of things. So the COMT could be slow, but another gene that breaks down a different metabolite, down a certain pathway may be overactive, right? So this is where
Mm-hmm.
it can get really complex, figuring out, all right, this cog in the machine works too slow, that works too fast, but that would affect this one. And that's where really cross-referencing really is highly important. But yes, that estrogen, I mean, on top of nowadays, just with all the xenoestrogens and the endocrine
Stuff in the environment.
disruptors,
Yep.
right? So, like, on top of that genetic aspect, the higher estrogen, we also have things in our bodies that are mimicking that estrogen. So that's why that estrogen dominance is such a huge thing nowadays. And as we mentioned, we'll briefly touch on it here, that estrogen, histamine follows estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
That's why most PMS issues, menopause issues, are due to that higher histamine. When I work with female clients and I see a lot of histamine related mutations, I ask them how your cycles, any major PMS, and I kind of know the answer most of the time because the more issues there are there. But as I mentioned, that histamine's linked to ADHD. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
connecting the
talk about that.
dots.
Yeah. So talk about
Yes.
that because I know you were talking about that on Instagram recently.
Yeah. So the histamine's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It revs up the brain. It promotes wakefulness and alertness. And histamine also stimulates adrenaline release. Adrenaline stimulates histamine release. So people may get rashes or hives when they're super stressed. Why is
Mm-hmm.
that? Because histamine, people think of histamine and think of rashes, allergies, which
That's
is
all they
true.
think about. Yep.
That's all they think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's why that can happen. But they prescribe they prescribe antihistamine meds for anxiety, sleep, and possibly ADHD at times. Some doctors will use that off label. So like my approach is, why are we blocking our body's ability to sense the histamine? Let's just lower it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the certain supplements, the certain foods can really make have that effect, especially if you're a highly sensitive person. So whether it's ADHD, OCD, autism spectral disorder, these are all the types of individuals that I see. The devil really, really, really can be in the details. Your kid who has trouble focusing, you give them some homemade soup that's very high in histamine.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
had my wife made some chicken soup, week or so ago. I'm not kidding you, I had 3 sips of it because it was so good. I had little sips, and I'm like, I barely had any. I think I'm gonna be okay. I was noticeably more revved up, not
Mm-hmm.
anxious, but overstimulated, because that's
Yeah.
the thing too. It's anxiety versus overstimulation. What's the difference? Anxiety has a fear component, a conscious
Mm-hmm.
fear. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't worried about, I wasn't worried about upsetting. I wasn't worried about a thing. I just felt revved up. And when I sat down to try and do work, I call it breaking the barrier. That's what I used to say to myself when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know it was ADHD. I didn't know it was executive
Executive
dysfunction,
function. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So how do I break the barrier? it's so much harder for me to break the barrier. Noticeably harder with 3 sips of homemade chicken soup broth. And like I say that to people, they're like, you're out of your mind. There's no way. But for people that are
Highly sensitive.
the
Yeah.
reason why we are how we are, again, any of these neurodivergent, whatever that umbrella term, it's because of these genetics. We are so sensitive because our cells are hardwired that way genetically. And at least for ADHD, that is a highly, highly heritable disease, AKA, it is the genetics primarily leading the way of that. So all these weird little patterns I picked up on, I feel a little off, this off. When I first started seeing people, I'm like, is this really gonna like help people as much as I think? Because maybe I'm just the most sensitive person in the world. Turns
Yeah,
out
people
like
are just hiding
80,
it.
yeah, turns out around I'd say 80% of my clients are highly sensitive people.
Yeah.
Why is no one else helping them? Because they're not looking in the details
Hmm.
finely enough. Oh, I took this supplement, I feel worse. Oh no, that never happens to anybody. Just take more.
Oh my
Little
God.
do they
Yeah.
know that it's raising their adrenaline. And for someone that's already sensitive to it, you're
You're
going to
gonna
feel so
like
much
double
worse.
down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and again, like I think this is why it's so helpful to have information. Again, like you are now understanding your body. You know
Mhm.
what's happening. You can say, "Hey, I drank this soup. I happen to know histamine's going to amp up my brain. I happen to know this kind of soup is high in histamine. I can put that together." Whereas most people, they might just feel revved up. There is no world in which people who did not have that genetic data are going to be like, "Oh yeah, it was totally that chicken soup." Like they don't understand, right? And so to me, like, and that was like that was part of like the power I took from a diagnosis is like it's it's neither here nor there whether we call it a label diagnosis, whatever, but it's more like,
Yep.
oh, now I know how my brain works. If you look at your genetics, you go, oh, now I know how the blueprint
Yep.
is written, and then I can decide what I'm going to do with that information. But like now I know what the blueprint is, and I can say, okay, well, if I'm responding this way, well, maybe it's just like how my dopamine is clearing, or maybe, it's this histamine that's driving this response. But you can understand yourself instead of making this judgment of like I'm doing it wrong, or like what's wrong with me? Why am I so revved up, or whatever? You just go, oh yeah, hey, I'm listening, I'm paying attention to my body. Here's what it's doing in response to this stimulus,
No,
right?
exactly. And you hit the nail on the head. And these, this is what I've been helping people do with the genetics for years now. But the stuff I've been working on lately is trying to figure out how do I educate people how to tune into their body.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured out the best way to do that is to teach people. Let me put it this way. When I was thinking about making resources for people to learn,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's ADHD, let's just say ADHD, headaches, and anxiety, I realized all the content would be the same because high histamine, high glutamate,
Mm-hmm.
high adrenaline, high sulfur. Those are just a few examples. All of those are linked to all of these different things. The better question is, why do some people with high glutamate get OCD? Some get ADHD, which by the way are usually very often diagnosed
Those
together,
are common.
right?
Yep.
Because
Mm-hmm.
again, these are man-made constructs about the labels that we're using. Instead of the top-down approach, looking at the label, the bottom up, the cellular pathways,
What's
I'm at the
driving that?
point now where I can tell right away something raised my histamine. What
Mm-hmm.
is it? I go back and look. Oh, that food had a little bit of onions that has sulfur. That
Mm-hmm.
stimulated me, right? So I'm actually making programs based on each pathway because I want you to try. Imagine if you could map out your whole day, supplements, foods, habits, and highlight it and say, wow, I had a lot of glutamate like around lunchtime today. And then you look at your notes and say, wow, I couldn't get crap done after lunch today,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's breaking it up by the underlying pathways. Is more of your issues glutamate? Is more of it histamine, right? And again, it's people like, where's the data, right? Where's the data showing that having a tomato for dinner can mess up your sleep? But we're not running studies with only highly sensitive people, right? We're data does not really, we can't live and die by the data when you're a highly sensitive person because they don't check to see if you're highly sensitive or not before they do
No.
these studies. And what I'm sharing here, I'm sharing it here specifically because individuals that are highly sensitive, no matter what the umbrella label is, you are the individual that is most likely to be much more sensitive and really respond very well to these minor food and supplement things that someone else may not even notice.
Yep. I also think that, there, this, it can be a tendency with a highly sensitive person to get obsessive,
Yes.
right? To be
Yeah,
like,
been there.
oh my
Yep.
God, okay, do I need to assess every single thing? And there are some broad brushstrokes that can help people initially before, and then they can like start going deeper into their own personal data. But you can say like, okay, broadly, it might be a bigger challenge with histamine if you have ADHD. And then we can say, okay, well, here's some high histamine foods, and then like start to like, okay, let's do a low histamine diet. And then you can start to like parse out, well, maybe which one of those things tends to make you feel worse.
Exactly. The goal is not perfection. The goal is not a no sulfur, no histamine.
It's also
no
like not possible to live on this planet and do it.
And that's why when I work with people that have a lot of dietary things, I'm like, listen, don't even look at this list of foods. We got to start with just a few. No one will ever have the perfect diet. It's all about figuring out, like, they say avocados are high histamine. I have avocados every morning. I'm fine. I figured out what's really more or less problematic for me personally. And the key is learning to backtrack, because you are going to get thrown off again. But you got to be able to register it and reverse engineer and look up those foods and go, oh, I know that's one of my problem foods now. Let me add it to the mental bank, right? Then you learn where the do not cross, where the
or
red
you write
tape
it
is
down
on which
like me,
types of
put it on a
things.
sticky note. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I do think the N=1 is wildly important. It is a gold standard, actually. And what I think people miss in things like research studies is when you're looking at such a wide variety of people, there's going to have been people who are like, when you average out, you have to realize like an average means that there's outliers. An average means that there were people on either end of the spectrum and how they responded. So just because like the average of those people showed this one result, well, also partly maybe some of those people got thrown out of the studies. Women, it's a really hard thing actually to get women into research studies because we're cycling and people don't like to study how women respond differently in different parts of the cycle. So half the time women weren't even in the studies. If women were in the studies, again, like you might not respond how the average did. So I always want to like put that big asterisk. People are like, well, literature shows. I'm like, well, literature showed like a majority of people in this one study, and we don't have any idea why they might have thrown somebody out. And we also don't have any idea what those outliers did. So maybe those outliers responded completely differently. And you have to know if you're an outlier, right? Like you can start with the average on the data, but you also have to say like, well, maybe I was one of those people who just didn't respond the way that everybody else did. And I think that means that you as the N=1 that's the gold standard. It's not like whatever the study said.
I could not agree more. And you're 1000% right. We are all genetically different. If you're testing, let's just say, I don't know, a supplement for depression and it boosts serotonin signaling, the people that respond the best, read between the lines here, they probably have more serotonin issues, right? If you're not fixing the right system for you, you're not going to respond well. I always say that clinical data is inherently flawed. I'm not a big math data guy as a PhD scientist because I understand we are all genetically different. They are not checking people that are in the same ballpark of genetics. They're not checking to see that. They want to find, and then you have the whole evidence-based community. Nope, that's a bunch of BS. Where's the randomized controlled trial? But we are all very, very different, and we can't be living and dying by data. Each one of those dots on a graph is supposed to be a biological replicate. So like when I was working in the lab, I'd grow cells in a petri dish. I would put some in a smaller dish. I would do my experiment. The big dish would keep growing. A couple days later, they're ready to be like split up again. I replate them. I do the experiment again. But do you see how it's the same exact cells genetically each time? That's called a biological replicate. If we do mouse studies, the mice are all brothers and sisters. They're inbred, right? So it makes it so much easier to get significant changes because everything is so much more similar.
It's controlled.
That's not the case with clinical data. And it really throws a wrench in everything. Living and dying by, all right, this supplement didn't hit that random mark of statistics. It's just shy of it. Let's throw out the entire hypothesis. This supplement does not help people with ADHD. What the heck are you talking about? I see 20% of the people responded amazingly. Nope. They want to get rid of it. They want to make a drug that fixes everyone with one thing. I work the opposite. I want to go I only look at the person in front of me and figure out what they need to feel their best. Of course, if you come to me with focus ADHD issues, I'll take that into account, but I'm not looking at you as someone with ADHD. You got to
Like, what
figure
are the
out what
pathways?
nutrients you're lacking.
Mhm.
Exactly, because it's just a man-made construct.
Have you started to see? So I have a much, this is not a randomized control study, but I started looking at genetic data in the last couple of years. And I was for people who had more of the predisposition for ADHD, just because I'm a curious human, not because I am like trying to do a randomized control study. But I started seeing like, well, what other nutrient pathways might be impaired? Some of the things I saw, like more than 3/4 of the people, issues with zinc, issues with vitamin D, issues with lactose, issues with gluten. Those are just some of the things that I was going to look for anyway. So
Mhm.
interesting to me to see that cross pollination. And I was like, well, of course, obviously, like this is driving these genetic pathways. Have you seen where like there's like a lot of correlation just in the humans that you're working with, where like most people who are more sensitive are like looking like they are, tending to have problems with vitamin D transport or something like that?
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting because my practice, it's all genetic based. And I gotta word this. Let's just say a mutation affects 20% of the population, but 3/4 of my clients have it.
Hmm.
Why is that? It's because if you come and search me out, the holistic genetic scientist, whatever you want to, whatever bucket of adjectives to describe me at this point, um, I'm not the first person you see. And why is it so high? Because I'm artificially selecting for people that have worse genetics, right? Because
Hmm.
why is no other ADHD protocol working for you? Why do you need a protocol built for you? Because the genes can be more skewed. So it's not even so much just for ADHD, but I see the methylation, vitamin D, histamine, and choline is a really big one that I see as well. Um, Choline's really, really important for neurotransmission. And like if you're medicated on Adderall or Vyvanse, people can get, muscle cramps and lower back pain. That's actually your body stealing choline from your muscles to supply your brain with the choline because the Adderall, the medication is making you fire so quickly, you're
Well, we
depleting
need,
these
yep,
things.
we need the cofactors. Yep.
Yeah. And again, like
Hmm.
you mentioned, the lactose, the gluten. And the way I look at that is what's downstream of lactose intolerance? What's downstream of a reaction to gluten? Histamine.
Hmm. Yep.
Histamine regulates inflammation. So to me, I view it as it's still the histamine signaling
We're still
pathway,
looking at histamine.
right?
Yep.
It's
Hmm.
just different. It's different like costumes or different at the very top of it, a different player at the top. But at the end, it's all going to flow through to
Hmm.
the histamine pathway. Even vitamin D, the lower your vitamin D, the higher your blood histamine levels. So
Yep.
that's why allergies are very often co-diagnosed, chronic allergy issues with ADHD. The histamines, you kind of see my brain, histamine is histamine is histamine. You're kind of like just dressing the pig in a different costume, right? But
Yeah.
that's why focusing on that pathway itself, food, supplements, what things could make that worse? Like I can't exercise later in the day. Exercise releases histamine.
Hmm.
So most of you listening probably ADHD or know someone. If you're gonna do exercise, do it
Do it in the
earlier in the
morning.
day.
I do way better in the
Yeah,
morning.
I
Hmm.
don't take any pre-workouts. If I exercise later in the day, I will be up and just be overstimulated from that histamine.
Yep. I'm very similar. And I absolutely figured that out too.
Yep.
Just like my own response. I'm like, I just can't. Like I feel
Yep.
great actually, like in the morning, it helps. There's like an afterglow effect with
Yep.
attention and focus. And I'm like, okay, great. I can like dial in. Evening, not so good, especially if I'm trying to do any like heavier duty cardio. Like I could do a
Yep.
few weights, but like I can't go hardcore. So a lot of the things we're talking about, we're dancing around a little bit genetic expression. And I would love for you to just kind of like, having the genes for something doesn't mean that it's going to express necessarily. I can look at blood work. I can see someone might have a genetic expression or sorry, a predisposition for like high cholesterol, but your cholesterol's, fine. Like I have a woman I'm working with who I love because she's in her 70s and she has been so dialed in. Like she's been working with like holistic practitioners and nutritionists for like 40 years, like probably like before I was born, right? But she is so healthy and yet her genetics predispose her to insulin resistance
Yeah.
and obesity and high cholesterol, and none of those are present for her.
Yep.
So, and she's just kind of like fine tuning her health, right? So there are genetics, which are obviously extremely important. And that's what we're talking about. And to me, like that, the reason I'm so interested in having this conversation is, that kind of is what led me down this
Yeah.
path was my genetics. So it was wildly useful. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily expressing, and we can change how things are expressing or not by things like lifestyle, supplements, food. So maybe share with us a little bit about like, what does it mean for something to express? And then
Yep.
when you're talking about these things that we use to help or to shift that expression.
Yeah. So genetics are the code, how the worker functions, right? It's called epigenetics. That is how many times, I gotta word this. How do I put this into the worker analogy? How many workers are you creating, right? So think of these workers. You could either make one worker, one COMT protein, or you can make five, right? In reality, there's very large numbers of each one of these proteins, not one per cell, but certain things we do can indeed regulate that. And I wouldn't so much think of it in terms of on or off. I would think of it more so of more or less, right? Like you're not going to just
Like a dimmer
not
switch.
have the COM. Yeah, the dimmer switch,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Mhm.
So these proteins, the epigenetics, and here's how it does tie back to genetics though. No matter how much you do or don't express a gene, that gene will always be mutated.
Yep.
So this is where it comes into play too. How many mutations are on that gene? For
Mhm.
some genes, you have one mutation. That may not be a big deal. But if you look at a surface level report, it all depends on how you're reporting these things at the end of the day, because all these direct to consumer companies, none of them are clinically validated, and they're throwing whatever. You don't see the back end. All you see is the reports they show you, and you're assuming them to be accurate. And I could tell you, I've seen the back end for a lot of these things. They are not accurate. They are
Mhm.
not, a lot of the time, they are not looking at enough information here. They're
Yeah.
trying to tell you you don't methylate as well based on 4 different mutations. Like
Oh, everyone wants to
there could
jump on
be
that
50
bandwagon.
mutations in a single gene, right?
Yeah.
Thousands of mutations. So
Uh-huh.
what you mentioned, someone had all these risks but didn't actually have them show up. Well, it is the lifestyle, right? If you're prone to insulin resistance, you eat low glycemic carbohydrates, you move your body, you make sure you have the right nutrients. Like, yeah, it may not be an issue. Or maybe that company's report they gave you just maybe, I'm trying to get a word of this. Let's just say they said based on 10 genes, 10 mutations, you're prone to insulin resistance. Well, what if you have 15 other mutations that make you less prone to insulin
Mhm.
resistance? How do you know where the cards fall at the end of the day? So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. And with epigenetics, what a lot of people aren't aware of, a lot of people hop on epigenetics. You can control your epigenetics, you can't control your genetics, which is true. If you rest, get good nutrients, limit your stress, your epigenetic health improves without a doubt. But I'm not saying this is you. People kind of almost make it sound as if like I can't sit here and be like, huh, let me turn off the COMT gene. Let me turn off this gene. We can't pick and choose. It's kind of
Yeah.
like either you have healthy epigenetic expression or unhealthy, right? But it is true. Why do you feel better? All right, let me put it this way. Why do you feel worse right after you eat McDonald's? Epigenetics, right? Any change in mood, millisecond, microsecond by microsecond, our cells are changing their gene expression all the time. You go to the gym, you have a good afterglow. Why did that happen? Because your cells changed what genes they were expressing. So they made more dopamine, they made more endorphins. You're walking down the street, listen to your favorite song, you feel great, you're on cloud 9. A car almost hits you, like swerves near you. Your heart drops. Changes in epigenetics, right? So these happen really, really quickly as well. So who's the one dimming the light switch, right? That's the methylation system. That's the MTHFR that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. We could touch on it, but people act like that is the end all be all. That is not true. If you guys hear someone trying to sell you just because your MTHFR gene's broken, you're broken, that is a bunch of snake oil stuff. You need to have a lot more data than just that. It is important, but that's just the new sensationalized thing that gives real genetics a bad name because it's not that simple. Nonetheless, there's other genes that are turning the switch on and off or up and down. So your genetics dictate your epigenetic capabilities as well. So you kind of see how it's like you have the genetics, you have the epigenetics, but it's almost like the nature dictates the nurture as well to some degree.
So there's just like, there's a strong interplay basically that's also not just happening. Like, it's not just like, oh, I did this one thing one time. We're having constant changes because that's how our bodies are designed to have adaptation moment to moment. And things that we're doing, eating, taking are going to change that expression. But it's also going to change it in that moment. We haven't we haven't changed the system. We're just saying like, is this system working more efficiently or less efficiently or more how we would want it to, and less maybe how we.
I mean, there is, and the thing too is there's things that are easily to epigenetically switch and things that are harder. When you think about childhood trauma, psychological trauma, PTSD, all you got to do to heal that, well, what happened is the wrong genes were turned up or turned down. That's what happened. You weren't born with that. How do you fix it? Well, you just go to those genes and you undo what you did in the first place. Now, of course, not even remotely that simple, right? It is not easy to just do that. But on paper, that's what we need to do. But why do you think things like MTHFR are linked to PTSD? They are linked to all these diseases because the light guy that's doing the light switches doesn't work as well. And that is why I'm not against, methylfolate for the right person, right? But it's not a universal prescription for people. But that's why these right targeted nutrients, based on which worker, different workers eat different things for lunch. Think of it that way.
Oh, see, that's a great analogy. Yeah.
And what one worker eats, MTHFR has a different lunch than the MTRR gene or the AHCY or CBS. These are other methylation genes. It's a cycle. It's a circle. So if you were to draw dots in a circle, and you drew the line through the dots, which point of the circle is the most important? They're all the same, right? It's so MTHFR, I don't think it's more important than other methylation genes. It's just by far the most studied, right? But that doesn't mean that it's more or less important. A lot of these other methylation genes that no one's really heard of yet, that there's data coming out, they're linked to all the same issues that MTHFR mutations are linked to. That's the focus for everyone. Let's just blast that, advertise, fear monger about it. But not everyone with MTHFR needs methylfolate, especially if you have that COMT mutation.
And there's more that goes into methylation.
Exactly. I'm trying not to go too deep here. I could ramble for like 4 hours about
I appreciate
this,
that.
but
well, so here's something that I think is actually important in that discussion. So it's like we figured out like, okay, we were going to provide, methyl forms of B12 and folate, for example, in a lot of supplements, and particularly in supplements that are either supposed to be, air quotes, energizing or stimulating in some way, but also even in like things like energy drinks and whatnot. Like it's wild to me because people bring me all the stuff that they're taking, and it's like I call the bag of supplements, but it's also like the bag of like I'm like, if it goes in your mouth, tell me what it is, and lots of energy drinks.
It's
whatever.
Not food. It's
like
all
it's all, and if you add it all up, sometimes it's like hundreds of thousands of like times the RDA, and I do not like live and die by the RDA, but you could say, hey, that's a line in the sand, right? Of methylated B12. And I can tell you, quick. It adds up so fast. And then also, so we're pushing way hard on B12, but not on any other B vitamins, which is already a problem. But also like you don't realize how much you're stimulating your system. And like for me, like I have I'm pretty like dialed in on how much like methylated B12 I can handle. And it's not very much. And
you go over, you feel that quickly, right?
I feel it real
like
fast. And like no sleep. And I actually can't do methylfolate. So I have to do like the adenosol, what is it? No, that's the B12.
No, the folinic acid.
Yeah. So, and I feel great. So if I'm doing folinic acid, no problems. If I keep either I, change the form of B12 or I have like, maybe I can go up few hundred times the RDA. But if I start getting into that
Yep.
echelons of thousands, then like I feel like complete trash. But again, like people just don't realize it. They're like, I'm not taking anything, or I'm not, and they don't realize it's also like in protein powders, like literally anything
Yeah,
where like
green. I've seen greens
green
powders as
drinks, like
well,
people are just throwing it
pre-workouts.
in everything.
They throw it in a joint health supplement. They throw it in this. They throw it
I
in
don't even know
that.
why. I'm
It
like,
is
why is it everywhere? I just don't
because there's no
understand.
regulation.
Yeah.
There's no regulation. You don't need to properly educate. And yeah, it's why I love doing what I do, because there's all these risks and people thinking there's so much more you could help yourself methylate than methylfolate or methyl B12. I mean, creatine, choline, glycine, taurine, these are all great things. And glycine, taurine, for the vast majority of people, they calm down the nervous system and
Hmm.
they help lower homocysteine without doing the methylation. I actually love utilizing glycine as I call a methyl sponge. So when you take glycine, one of my favorite supplements, when you take glycine, your body methylates it 3 times into trimethylglycine.
Okay,
It's
hold
also
on.
called
You're gonna have to tell people what methylates is.
yeah, yeah. So methylate is like putting a sticky note
There you go.
on certain molecules. So when COMT, that MT stands for methyl transferase. It transfers methyl groups. So it'll take a methyl group, a sticky note from the molecule SAMe, puts the sticky note on dopamine, puts the sticky note on adrenaline, puts the sticky note on estrogen. They are now inactive. They can't do anything in the body. So, what was the first thing? How do we
We were talking
initially
about
zoom out?
glycine, and
Yeah, so
glycine is,
glycine. Yeah, so
yep.
glycine, your body will methylate that in 3 areas. So, what I tell people to do, if people are experimenting with B vitamins, glycine is amazing at soaking up excess methyl groups. So, like if there's a multivitamin or B complex that like is a really good formulation, someone's just a little overstimulated on it, adding a little bit of glycine just can bind up some of those methyl groups. Or if I overdo it with methyl vitamins, I'll have a little spoonful of glycine. It tastes like sugar. I love it. So it's
I drink it
binding
with
up,
water at bedtime.
right? It's
Yeah, helps
so
me go
good.
to
Yeah, that's
bed.
literally me too. I do the big
Yeah.
scoop. Yeah, it's great.
Uh-huh.
Kids love it too because it literally truly does taste
It's like
just like
sugar water.
sugar,
It tastes like sugar
literally.
water. Yeah.
So not everyone needs the methylfolate, the methyl B12. I don't do methyl B12. I have, I think, around 400 micrograms of methylfolate. So like a low, moderate dose, but they sell 5 milligrams,
It's
15 milligram. I think
wild to me. What's
Deplin is prescription methylfolate.
hmm
I don't want to mess this up. I'm pretty sure Deplin is 15 milligrams of um, methylfolate. Yes, 15 milligrams. I have never come across someone that does well on 15
No.
milligrams. Like I don't know why is this a thing? People are taking milligrams, 5 milligrams of methylfolate because they were told by their naturopath or whatever, hey, you have MTHFR, take this. How many mutations do you have? If your MTHFR works 80% as well as it should, if you're not in a bunch of toxicity, mold, things like that, if you're not eating processed garbage, you may not even need any methylfolate. But if you're someone that it works 20% as well, yeah, you may want to consider that, especially if you're living in mold or you're not eating the best diet. So, and again, this is where the dosage comes into play as well. And yeah, it's just crazy to me. People always say how, what is it, the VAERS, the vaccine adverse reaction, whatever,
hmm
where you report, people always say, oh, well, that's undervalued. The people that are anti-vax, we won't go there, but just saying in general for the concept here, like, oh, we underreport vaccine injuries because people don't actually go and report it. What about supplement related injuries? Of course,
hmm
I'm going to get all the horror stories, right? That's why people hire me, right?
Right.
But the stuff I see, especially coming from other holistic practitioners, what the heck are you doing? But it makes perfect sense when there's little to no training on supplement pharmacology, right? You don't need to be a master in genetics. You should understand pharmacology before you use these things, if you ask me.
hmm Well, I think, when people are talking about pharmacology, they're usually talking about drugs.
Yep.
So it's harder because you're right. There's very
Yep.
little
It's all the
training
same
on,
concepts though,
yep.
right? So
hmm
I was trained about pharmaceuticals to make chemotherapy drugs, and that's what my thesis was on. But it's all the same concepts because you're learning how things interact with our cells. So the targets, right? The
Yep.
receptors they bind to. And a receptor is like a baseball mitt that catches something, right? In order for your cells to feel vitamin D or dopamine or adrenaline or histamine, your cells got to catch it. And those are my favorite mutations. You can't
hmm
catch things as well. Um, but where was I going with this? I totally blanked.
Yeah, so we were talking about
There's the ADHD
pharmacology.
trailing off, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
the
no.
pharmacology. Yeah. So the it's still the same system, the same cell. It's just now instead of I took all that knowledge, I never would have been able to do what I do now without that
That
training. I never
background.
regret
Yep.
my PhD. Yeah, I left conventional med. I left all of that, but I never regret it for a day. I would never be able to look this deep without knowing that. But it's all the same stuff, right? It's just a
Yeah.
different thing coming in.
Different
The
mechanism.
the
Yep.
same
Or same
things,
mechanism.
the same parts of cells that interact with drugs, the cells don't have drugs and medications don't bind things that vitamins and nutrients don't act on necessarily. Some drugs target things that a supplement can't, but a lot of them there's natural things. So to me it's all one and the same here. I'm not a nutritionist, but I believe pharmacology is very similar to nutrition, except maybe instead of it looking at how you burn more fat, metabolism, when I'm talking about the histamine foods, the glutamate foods making your issues worse, it's kind of like pharmacology. I'm just seeing the glutamate in the food is pharmacologically interacting with your cells, just
hmm
how a Alzheimer's medication would. So it's all one and the
Right.
same.
Yeah. I think where there's an important level in that we need specific nutrients for biochemical pathways within the cell to work.
Yep.
So there's where if we're missing nutrients, then we're going to have those cellular functions not working as well. So that's one part where we're looking at the nutrients either not having enough or having an imbalance so that those cogs in the wheel, we use that
Yep.
analogy, are not working as well. And then there are other things that are other chemical constituents of food or supplements like histamine that are going to impact different cellular receptors, which is a little bit different than how we are optimizing if cells work. I get that right?
Yeah. Yes. And now,
Yeah.
so, I mean, even we look at the patterns I mentioned before, low iron,
Yep.
low vitamin D, high histamine. Give those examples. When you really dive deeper, it makes perfect sense because you need iron to synthesize these neurotransmitters.
hmm
Low vitamin D, when your cells catch that, when the receptor catches it, it binds your DNA. It literally tells your cells to make more workers that make serotonin and dopamine.
hmm
High histamine in the brain does the opposite. It tells your cells to stop making those workers. So you see how, of course, all three of those would be linked to ADHD, along with a lot of other mental health related
Yep.
things, right?
hmm
Because they're downstream of that. It's not like, oh, I have less iron. No, but what's the missing piece there?
What's
I'm
the
missing
mechanism?
iron. I can't make my dopamine as well. I have too much histamine. I can't make my dopamine as well. I have low vitamin D. I can't make. So you see how they all
hmm
funnel towards the same thing. That's why I love and I try to preach and try to educate around thinking in terms of these pathways because it really simplifies for people instead of this separate anemia, but it could be this thing too. But that when you understand that, it's like, oh, well, it all comes back
All
to the
roads lead
dopamine
to.
and the neurotransmitters,
hmm
just different paths, different flavors of that. Everyone with ADHD has, I don't even want to say messed up. They have different neurochemistry
Yep.
than someone without it, right? I'm not
hmm
even going to say whether it's good or bad. It depends what
It's different.
environment that you're in.
hmm
Um, Part of that is hardwired genetic, right? But because we don't want to change who we are. ADHD, like my sensitivity, I used to view it as a weakness. Now I'm like, this is great. I get to feel more out of life. Yeah, the highs are high, the lows are low, but like I'd rather have that than be, bored in
One
life,
note.
right?
Yep.
Exactly. So trying to figure out which flavor that person is. And I like to say we're all a unique shape. The goal is never to change the shape of a person. The goal is to take those sharp edges and kind of smooth them out a bit, right?
Yeah,
So
make
like
life a little easier.
when I get overstimulated, I want to not be as overstimulated. But
Yeah.
what I really like to tell people is you're gonna get overstimulated again. That's life. But my goal is to make sure you have the tools to recover at least 80% faster. So let the stress happen, your sensory overload, it is what it is. But instead of it being like the whole day, I want you to set a timer for an hour, maybe take some nutrients, do some tools that we give you, and get back to normal sooner.
To
So
baseline.
it's a
Yep.
lost hour, not a lost day.
Or
Then you
week.
beat yourself up. Exactly.
Yeah.
Then you ruminate. Then you
Yep.
start shaming yourself. Why am I so different? Why am I so messed up? It's the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, 100%. I like the idea of setting a timer. I might steal that one. But yeah, it's
Yeah. So
helpful. You just like,
my timer's an hour, and what I'll do is if I feel really not in it, I may, take a little bit of lemon balm or take something to kind of just settle the nerves a little bit. I may go for a quick walk or something, or honestly, I may just like sit down and scroll on my phone and no longer than an hour, right? And then I'm back to it. And I've noticed that that helps a lot with giving yourself the space to do that, because people wired like us, we're not meant to sit and grind out work for 8 hours
doesn't work.
unless it's the occasional hyperfixation. Then we're going to do it for 16 hours, right?
Right. But that's not every single day, all day.
No.
Because then we're done.
If only we could really harness that truly, and if we could control when we turn it on and off, we'd be unstoppable. But
I actually feel like this is a complete side note, and this is totally how my brain like makes those weird connections. But
Yeah,
I'm
I
like,
love
this is what all the Disney princess movies lately are about, like the Frozen, it's not just Frozen. There's another one that was, it's Wicked. It's all like, hey, you have a power, but you haven't learned how to harness it. Like Elsa, I don't even know if you've seen this.
I've not seen
they're
Frozen,
kid
no.
movies, and they're kid movies and they're female focused girl movies. But basically, it's like she's got this wild power to be able to freeze the entire world, but she just can't control it. And like the whole movie is her learning how to control it. Like with Wicked,
harness your
like
gifts.
yeah. And so it's like, okay,
Yeah.
well, it's crazy and out of control and breaks things when you don't know how to harness it. But if you can figure out how to like put a few bumpers around it, then you can, then it can be powerful, right? So it's not just like yes or no. It's like, okay, well, it exists. I can't make it not exist. How can I like harness this to work a little bit better for me? So I absolutely think of that.
You got to change your environment to you, right? Once you really understand what you need to work better, and that is not what you're seeing shows, what neurotypicals, glamorize. It's not. We have our own way of doing things that works for us. And I've seen those memes. It's like when you tell someone with ADHD that it won't work that way, and it's like, that's all the ammunition I needed, right? Now we're more motivated than ever just to show you
let
there
me
are
show you,
many different ways to do it.
I will prove. Yeah. So this has been a really enlightening conversation. I've been super excited to dive deep on the nerdiness. I even have more nerdy questions that I didn't get to because we could probably just talk for hours. And
well, we could do it next time. I'd be more than happy
maybe
to
we'll do a part
come on
2.
again.
Yeah.
This was great. Yeah.
Didn't get to ask you about DRD2. But
I was actually going to touch on that. Yeah. We'll
all right,
hold off on that. Yeah.
Give me 2 minutes. Give me your 2-minute Cliff's notes. Because that's another genetic mutation that is often correlated with ADHD.
So the COMT affects how much dopamine is released in the brain. But as I mentioned, your brain needs the baseball mitt to catch the dopamine. So you feel something.
Yep.
So like when you take an antihistamine, what does it do? It blocks the baseball mitt, but it doesn't get rid of the baseballs. So COMT regulates how many baseballs are in the baseball field, but the mitt doesn't work as well. The baseball doesn't, just having more baseballs, you don't necessarily feel that. So there's many receptors dopamine can bind to. The dopamine receptor 2, that can be mutated. That's one I check very common in my practice. It's very common. And I'll see usually more neurological things when someone has more mutations there. That's linked to ADHD, depression, increased risk taking, obesity, addiction, because you can't get high off your own supply as well. So this is where it's like COMT, I'm higher dopamine, but I don't feel that way. We got to look at how well you sense it. I'll touch on briefly the dopamine 4 receptor. I think that's really interesting. that it's believed that that's also linked to ADHD. That receptor was mutated millennia ago. They believe that was one of the main drivers that when we were ancient ancestors, we were human species was still in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
What initiated to migrate?
Mm. Oh, interesting
Individuals
question. Yeah.
that had that dopamine 4 mutation. If you're someone that loves novelty, that
Mm-hmm.
always need to be doing something new, and that's probably most of you listening right now, right? That's a component, a tenet of ADHD.
Yep.
You likely have this dopamine 4 receptor mutation. You love to travel, you can't just keep doing the same thing. That you got to try something new all the time. So, boom, something happened. Those individuals that got that mutation, they're more likely to be like, huh, let's go over there. And they're like, Jimmy, why do you want to go over there? Well, I don't know. It just looks different over there. Let's go
I
check it
haven't been
out.
there. Let's go
So they
see.
go and explore. And then that's what initially led us to leave Africa and disperse outward. So it's like the curiosity, they call it the wanderlust gene. I just wanted to share that. I love that that's explaining the evolution of our entire species. ADHD perhaps being an evolutionary advantage for the people that wanted to be the explorers. Like I'm trying to think whether it's, I don't know, like all these ancient explorers like Lewis and Clark or, Christopher Columbus. I bet they probably had the wanderlust gene too,
Well, yeah,
right?
you totally. So now, like now what's open in my brain, I'm like, is like the entire United States just basically like we're all pre-wired because
Well,
anyone who
now,
would
when
get on
we're
a
a melting pot now, though, so you got to remember
we
that.
are, but like still
Yeah.
like for hundreds of years, like all the only people who are coming are not the people who want to stay
Well,
safe.
actually, think
They're
about
willing to
this.
get on a boat. They're willing to get on a
Yeah.
boat and come here. Even it doesn't
Well,
matter where
I
you're
was just
coming
gonna say
from.
that
Like
even though we're a melting pot,
all
the
the melters,
individual
all melters had to
no,
come
that's a
over
good
here.
point. Yeah, yeah. All the melters that came over here, they must have more of a proclivity. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you
Super
just think about
interesting.
it, like, especially like, again, like when we're coming on boats, it's not like an airplane that takes you, which is still a long time, like 7, 8, 12 hours.
Yeah,
You're like, this
you're
is going to
committing.
take me like 4 months and I don't even
Yeah,
know that I'm going to get there. I might die at sea. You got to have a certain personality type to go get on
yeah,
that boat.
yeah,
So, I
yeah,
mean, I think we
yeah,
have, I think
yeah.
we pre-selected a whole bunch of those kind of people for us. Um, I do want to, I have a few questions that are just fun, like
Yeah,
completely random questions, but I'm not going to ask you those yet. That's my final four
sure.
for women who are struggling with ADHD. And they're really just like, hey, I want to know some action points. First of all, I'm going to be able to point them to you and connecting
Mhm.
with you if we want to look into some more of that
Yep.
genetic piece. People want to look at the individual things for themselves. But like, again, with some of those broad brushstrokes, knowing also that there is that COMT relationship both to dopamine and estrogen,
Mhm.
for women who are like, I need a couple of things that are just like, here's my immediate takeaways that are probably things that might support me, or at least are worth doing that N=1 experiment on. What are some of those things that are going to help with that?
Yeah, so I think allergy testing is really important. Allergies are way more than just itching, sneezing, runny nose. I got allergy tested. I was very allergic to peas and almonds. I ate them every day for lunch. This was
Oof.
during my PhD. I could not write it was so hard for me to write and to get things done. I was allergic to mice. I worked with them every day for
Oh my
almost
God.
six
I can't
years.
imagine being in a lab and you're
But
allergic to mice.
I never sneezed. I never got
Wow.
hives. I never got itchy skin. I had to go to 5 different allergists because they wouldn't test me. They told me I didn't have allergies. They gaslit me because I wasn't
That's horrible.
sneezing. But that was a big factor for lowering my histamine
Yeah.
by getting rid of these things,
Yeah.
changing my experiments like overnight. It may not turn up anything, but it could really be
Totally
life
worth
changing for
exploring.
people.
Yeah.
And you want to get a skin prick test or an IgE. E is an
Mhm.
Eric. IgGs are more sensitivities. They're not true allergies.
Yep.
That's one thing I recommend. And especially for the women, I really love pycnogenol. It's an active ingredient in pine bark. That's been shown to block certain genes that are linked to allergies and histamine. So
Mhm.
that's been shown to not only help with ADHD and cognitive health, it's also been shown to help with every symptom of PMS and menopause without affecting hormones whatsoever. So going back, that's kind of a good connecting the dots what we discussed, right? We talked about how high histamine can be linked to
Mhm.
ADHD. It can be linked to PMS issues.
Yep.
So you look at the clinical trials for this one nutrient. Well, yeah, it makes perfect sense that it could help with those different
Both of
things.
those
Also
things.
helps with
Yeah.
blood flow as well. I think that's a great one for people to try. The one potential very minor risk, I always look giving all the information. It helps with blood flow, which means it can lower blood pressure. So if you're
Mhm.
someone with very low blood pressure, you can still try it. Just be mindful. If you notice, I feel a little dizzy getting up, yep, little too low for you, right? You don't want to lower
Mhm.
that anymore. But the allergy testing, the pycnogenol, and I think the vitamin D is a really big
It's
one
a
as
huge one.
well,
Yeah.
without even looking deep into the genetics. Some people, that baseball mitt is so beaten up with the genes for vitamin
Mhm.
D.
Mhm.
They need to go up to 100 for vitamin D. Very high in the norm. This is not a recommendation
And you're
across the
talking
board.
about the on a blood test you want to be
Yes,
looking
on the
at. Yeah.
blood test, that
Yeah.
nanograms from US units. So 30 to 100, the very high end of normal. I don't recommend that for everyone.
Hmm.
If the receptor is 10 mutations there, we get you up there. Sometimes we're 3xing the vitamin D. Their regular doctor is saying that's too high. They're like, screw you. I could finally get stuff done now.
Hmm.
Right. So, but I would recommend people try experimenting. Get your vitamin D levels up to an 80 or so for a month or two, see how you do. I've seen all the data. People that are very anti vitamin D supplementation, you're not going to run into issues trying that with a little bit of vitamin K2 for a month or two, guys. Like that is such a blip in the grand scheme of things. Should you be redlining 100 nanograms per milliliter for years without looking at anything? No, I'm not saying that,
Yeah.
right? But experiment
See
a
how you
little.
feel.
That
Yep.
N equals one there. Those are some big ones. And also what you said too, um, I mentioned to you, I'm working on these. I'm not sure when this will air, but I think it should be at least the histamine mini course should be out that I'm making because I'm really
Mm.
trying to. I don't want to have to see genetic testing to work with everybody, right? I want you guys to be able to have resources to, again, map out your day and try to look to see which things I'm doing, what list of things and what priority are top concerns for me. I'm really excited for that because that's how you really make the most change, getting this out to people, right? And having
Yep.
people learn for themselves because your doctor isn't going to really know you as well as you know you.
Oh
You
man.
just
Yep.
need a lot of
Or
it comes down
listen.
to patterns. But
Yep.
in order to understand patterns, you got to know what to look for. You got to know where the
Hmm.
dots are. And this education platform I'm going to be doing is all about showing you the dots. And you look at your life and say, yep, that dot's on my map. That dot isn't. That dot is. That dot isn't. Here are all my dots. Let me try experimenting with those dots. N equals one and reap the rewards of that.
There's probably, I don't want to take us down another rabbit hole, but there probably is a case for AI in this one too. Like I'm a very I don't know how you are about AI. I'm very pro all of the things I'm getting out of this, like
Yeah.
putting in some data and like, okay, like here's the data, here's what I ate, here's my questions, like knowing like I upload a food list and I'm like, here's the high
Yep.
histamine foods, put in my food diary, here's my food diary. When you look at the food diary and you look at the high histamine food list, what's the first five things I should look at, right? Like
Yep. Well,
I
that's what's down the road,
kind
right?
of what you're
At this
looking
point
at.
right
Yeah.
now, it's like I'm still very curious to see. I have seen certain wrong supplements can raise histamine that are very helpful. We're not going to go down that road right now. My point being, I've seen this philosophy, this approach help hundreds of people that I've worked with. I'm very, very curious to see me breaking it down in a very palatable way, low cost. I'm doing some free resources as well. I'm just so curious to hear the feedback. How many people their issues can be largely, I'm not saying this is a magic cure all to everything, right? Not what
Right.
I'm saying here, people, but how many people could feel noticeably better by not having broccoli for dinner,
Hmm.
by not having tomatoes for lunch, by not having black coffee and glutathione for breakfast, by
Hmm.
not these things. And I'm very curious to see. Maybe this is only a smaller niche thing for highly sensitive people, but hey, that's probably you
That's a
listening,
lot of people.
right? It is a
Yeah.
lot.
So
That's
that
what
is
I'm
a
saying.
lot of people.
It
Yeah.
is. No, sorry. It is. I
Yeah.
guess my point was I'm very curious to see the responsiveness. How many people are like, this really did change my life? Like I've
Yeah.
seen it happen for people, but I'm
Hmm.
also really selecting for those more sensitive people. But yeah, super excited for that. And I also want to offer a discount code for all your listeners as
Please do.
well
Yeah.
for the deep dive analysis. What would you want it to be?
What do I want it to
You
be?
like for so people know like whatever what do you want them to enter on my website to get the discount, just so they know it's like coming
Oh,
from
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah. How about focus?
Sure. All right, we will do focus, and then that'll save you $250 on a deep dive consult with me. I'll say that, big picture view, it's cheek swab. I could take a lot of genetic data from other companies. I hand make the reports, and we have an hour-long call. This is not a pre-printed report where you have all the same gene check to someone else. I really custom tailor this, and I need to get to know you more before we give you the exact plan and hand pick the right things for you. I don't want to give you 40 pages of reports and you're more
That you can't do anything
confused and
with. Yeah.
nervous than ever.
Yeah.
I'm doing a different approach of doing it. I cannot work with nearly as many people. That's not my goal right now. I'm concerned with making the best possible impact on each person first. I'll scale that later, right? I don't need to ship out millions of kits, tell people a tiny bit. But yeah, so that'll save you $250 on that. And the focus will be the code for that.
Amazing. That's awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to put, I'll put that link in the show notes and I'll make sure and put
Yep.
that code in there as well.
And I think the other link real quick too. So the histamine core stuff I mentioned.
Oh yeah, I think
I'm
that's
gonna have you drop a
super
link.
helpful.
There's gonna be a 15-minute big picture view kind of about the pathway stuff, right? So that'll be the other link that you'll get sent to. But from there, it's kind of a choose your own adventure, right? I want to make sure it could be 15 minutes of your time. I have a feeling you guys are gonna like it. There's a full length version of that about how cells work, then going into histamine, because I'm trying to see how much complex science can I make palatable for the average person, just so you can really understand your body and not need to run to a different coach or doctor for every little thing of brain fog, this and that, when it might be the wrong supplements or wrong foods or more habits or wrong habits for you.
That you can figure out pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yep.
I love that. And I absolutely have seen a lot of relationship to that histamine
Yep.
piece personally as well. I know you have a hard stop. I have a fast 4 and I'm going to see if we
Sure.
can get through them like super fast. Question number 1. I'm a big music fan. Do you remember your first concert?
Yes, my first concert was Warped Tour. Warped Tour heavy metal concert. This was probably early middle school. Early middle school.
Might have picked you for a metalhead, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. I was lead guitar in a heavy metal band for a bit, but now I'm all about electronic music.
That's fun. Oh, right. I remember that. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I'll have to hold that. That's all I listen to while I'm trying to, while I work. That helps me.
Yeah.
That helps me focus. Okay. Question number 2, what's on your nightstand?
My nightstand, I have my highly sensitive person sleep kit number 101. I have my wax high quality earplugs. I have my eye mask. I have my nose strip. I have my mouth tape. I have my blue blocker glasses. And let me think. I probably have 2 or 3 glasses of water there because I always keep bringing one up from the kitchen over and over and over again.
Yeah, the 18 glasses. That's kind of
Yep.
that's a sign I look for. Do you have a morning routine? And if so, what does it look like?
Morning routine for me is wake up. I was doing breath work. Got to get more back into that again. I was doing good for a bit, but usually I'm wake up, light breakfast, go to the gym, wear down the body so the mind can be sharper, right? Like kind of how you mentioned there. Then I'm coming back home, cold shower and starting my day. And if I'm not training that day, usually walk in the morning. But I'm really trying to get the sunlight as early as possible, get that circadian rhythm going.
Well, I hear you got your vitamin D, and I hear with that cold shower, you're spiking your own dopamine. Cool stuff. Any unusual talents or something that you're proud of that nobody knows about you?
I used to do a lot more painting, drawing. Also been playing music throughout my life. So I was like all state trumpet in high school. I could kind of any instrument could kind of give it to me. Give me 5 minutes, I'll be able to play something for you there. So yeah, whether it's the audio side or the visual side of art, very, very creative. Comes with the territory, right? With the ADHD,
totally.
all that stuff. And yeah, not a lot of people know that. Not a lot of people know that about me.
Yeah, I love that. I'm way into music, like I said, but I played instruments and all that too. So Awesome. Well, I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so excited for all the women who are going to be helped by listening to this, and also, maybe looking a little deeper into their own genetics and figuring out those pieces of like, hey, what's triggering me? How can I help? How can I feel better? In like a fairly straightforward and simple way.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for this conversation. And yeah, I will drop all the links in the show notes.
Thank you so much. Really hope you guys listening got some value out of this. And until next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Territory, right? With
Yeah,
the ADHD,
totally.
all that stuff. And yeah, not a lot of people know that. Not a lot of people know that about me.
Yeah, I love that. I'm way into music, like I said, but I played instruments and all that too. So
Yeah.
awesome. Well, I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so excited for all the women who are going to be helped by listening to this, and also, maybe looking a little deeper into their own genetics and figuring out those pieces of like, hey, what's triggering me? How can I help? How can I feel better? In like a fairly straightforward and simple way.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for this conversation. And yeah, I will drop all the links in the show notes.
Thank you so much. Really hope you guys listening got some value out of this. And until next time.
Ready to finally understand your ADHD brain and feel like yourself again? Listen to Christine McCarroll's ADHD Naturally podcast for holistic women and discover how to thrive naturally.